Hello, hello. Thanks everyone for joining. So excited to have you here for today's Taproot webinar on exploring results from our 2024 nonprofit resiliency survey efforts. Really excited to be with you all today for this event. I know we're nearing year end and you've probably got lots of things on that to-do list you're trying to get done before the end of the year. So we really do appreciate you taking the time to hang out with us today and dig into something that's really important, right? Taproot's community is a really vast one. We work with obviously nonprofits across the US and in other regions as well. We work with countless individuals who are just passionate about making a difference through their volunteerism or other forms of social impact, as well as companies and foundations who are looking at new, deeper ways to build those community relationships, to give back to their community members. And so we don't take it for granted that you all took time to be here with us today, and we're excited to dig in and learn with all of you and to hear your reflections on what this data, how this data resonates with you, the insights that you are drawing from it alongside Taproot. So welcome again. For the folks who are maybe just learning about Taproot's research effort, I want to take a moment before we officially dig in to just share a little bit of background context behind this research initiative, so you understand kind of the purpose and the goals behind why we invested time and energy, and why we're now investing in sharing out the results from this effort. I think we're all aware that the last few years have challenged us all in ways that we never expected, right? From COVID-19 pandemic still ongoing, financial challenges, political upheavals, and we know the next year ahead will be especially tumultuous as well for our US-based audiences. And amidst the uncertainty, we also know that nonprofits have led the way in providing vital services, strengthening and uplifting communities. And so the big question on our minds at Taproot, and also on the minds of, I'm sure, our friends at other intermediary organizations, other funding organizations, and just people who care, right? People who are invested in social causes and want to see their neighborhoods and communities strengthened, and see nonprofits leading the way in doing that. The big question on our minds collectively is, as nonprofit organizations continue to meet these rising community needs, these rising community demands, how can we as individuals or we as institutions better support their work? And so to help answer or address this big question, Taproot conducted a nonprofit sector survey in late fall of 2024, so late fall of this year, to help better understand the hurdles that social good organizations, social good leaders are currently facing in accessing and managing volunteer capacity building resources and other vital capacity strengthening resources. So the goals, obviously, Taproot as a nonprofit that serves our fellow nonprofits, one of our goals is we want to strengthen our support of nonprofits' missions through responsive program design and resource development. But another goal as this network, as this movement leader, right? We want to push skills-based volunteerism, push pro bono capacity building, push that field forward, and use and leverage our position and our relationships with folks across the intermediary space, foundation space, the corporate space, to also increase their support of the nonprofit sector in this next year and in the years to come. So therefore expanding our collective ability to get nonprofits the support they need for free. So today we're going to be walking through some of that survey data, and I'll also share a few ways that individuals and institutions can take action right now. As you're planning for 2025, you're making your social impact goals, thinking through what actions you can take in support of building more resilient and sustainable nonprofits going forward. So that's the plan for today. Really appreciate folks who are starting to introduce themselves in the chat. I'm going to take a moment to introduce myself as well. And so if more folks want to join Brittany in shouting out who they are, maybe the organization they're joining from, where you're based, I would love that. I know we have a good diverse crop of folks on the line today in terms of the perspectives that you're bringing into this discussion. So would love to see those intros start to come in. My name is Kimberly Swartz. You can call me Kim. I'm Taproot Senior Director of Community Engagement, which really just means I have this really awesome job of creating experiences that bring folks together for social impact. And so I know I see some familiar names on the line. I know I've either worked with you as a nonprofit or a volunteer before, so really appreciate you joining this discussion and excited to hear your thoughts as we go through some of this data. A few event logistics. This is a webinar format, so all attendees have been muted. We'll be relying on you to use that chat box that you should see in the bottom corner of your screen to communicate with me. I'm going to try and stay tuned into that chat box as much as possible, but I also have some Taproot colleagues on the line who, if you answer a question and they have a more immediate response to it, definitely stay tuned for that. So shout out to Kristen Mayku, our wonderful marketing associate who's going to be helping me throughout with logistics in the chat. And we'll also have time for some Q&A at the end of the event as well. We'll save some space. We do have closed captioning enabled as well. You can always disable that if that feature is not helpful for you. Just click on the settings wheel that you should see floating under my face at the moment. And then finally, we are recording this event, and we will make the recording publicly available on our YouTube and on our website. So if you do end up needing to hop out early, no worries. You'll be able to fast forward right to the point that you had to jump out at. Okay, thanks everyone. I can see folks introducing themselves. It's great to have you here. Casey, Ninfa, Gina, Erland, Michael, Dana, really, really grateful that you're all taking a chance to introduce yourself. And if folks see someone who they're interested in getting to know further, please don't hesitate to share LinkedIn profiles or website links. We definitely encourage community building and networking in the chat of our events. So don't feel shy about sharing those details. As folks continue to introduce themselves, I'm putting up a slide here for folks to get a chance to meet Taproot a bit. I know in the registration form for this event, we did have some folks just submit questions about who we are and why our nonprofit conducted this effort in the first place, which is why I took a few moments at the start of the event to address that. But I also just wanted to share a little bit more about our mission. So as you may know, Taproot, we're a nonprofit that exists to support our fellow nonprofits. So we were founded way back in 2001 with this knowledge that there's a massive resource gap present in the social sector. So organizations who may very well have the solutions to our world's most pressing challenges, they simply don't have the financial means, the budget, or the staff capacity to fully carry out those missions. And so Taproot's work, we're really trying to democratize access to resources for nonprofits, regardless of their mission area, their budget size, who they're led by, or the years they've been in operation. And we're doing that by mobilizing skilled volunteer resources from the corporate space to advance this resource equity. And so as we talk through the data today, that's the lens in which Taproot is approaching this research effort in, right? We're approaching it through this lens of we want to get nonprofits the resources we need for free, and we have a hypothesis that pro bono and skills-based volunteer resources can be a solution in bridging this resource gap. A little bit more about Taproot Foundation programming. You may know us through Taproot Plus, which is an open access free online platform that connects marketing, human resources, tech, strategy, finance, etc. Professionals with opportunities to assist nonprofits and small businesses who are in need of their expertise. We're available across the United States and a few other international regions as well. Or you may know us through our advisory services programming. In order to fuel our nonprofits' work of creating connections between your organizations and dedicated volunteers, Taproot partners with forward-thinking companies and grant makers to develop custom skills-based volunteering programs. Since 2001, our advisory services team has collaborated with over 100 Fortune 500 companies and other organizations to really carefully match the expertise of corporate employee talent with nonprofits and small businesses who need support to generate this impact. And then finally, we have this third bucket, just as important as the other two, around field building. Taproot's a nonprofit that's dedicated to serving our fellow nonprofits, like I said, by mobilizing this deeper level of volunteerism and community engagement. And so we're here to change hearts and minds, right? Making it so that every nonprofit has access to the professional infrastructure and capacity resources that they need to fully act on their missions. And we want to make the pro bono and skills-based volunteerism ethic so well established across professional fields like finance and advertising and HR and IT and more, that nonprofits have this full democratic, equitable access, right? And so to that end, Taproot conducts regular nonprofit and skills-based volunteerism sector research efforts like this one to help us develop resources that are also free to access for folks across our community to help make sure that pro bono is a readily accessible and trustworthy resource for nonprofit organizations. So hence why we are here today, digging into the results of the research effort that we conducted in 2024. All right, so without further ado, I want to go ahead and start digging into that information, because I know that's why many of you are most interested in being here. So let's start by getting to know the respondents that Taproot engaged through this research effort. So I'm going to take us through just some of the demographic details of our respondents, both on an individual basis and the organizations that these respondents were representing as they answered our survey. So we had 571 respondents, the majority representing US-based nonprofits. 63% of our respondents indicated that their organizations were based out of the United States. So that's definitely something to keep in mind as we're going through the data today. This is certainly US-centric results that we're going to be looking at. We had 12 countries represented, and regions like Canada, India, the United Kingdom, and Uganda were among the highest number of respondents outside of the United States. I also want to note that respondents skewed towards nonprofits that Taproot has existing relationships with. I mean, I want to note that it feels a little obvious, but I think it's important to note because obviously these are organizations that are going to have heard of pro bono or heard of nonprofit capacity building, skills-based volunteerism before. And so in order to try to diversify the responses as much as possible and pull in folks from other networks outside of just the Taproot pool, we did engage lots of community partners and paid promotional efforts to try to reduce survey bias as much as it was possible for our nonprofit too. So Taproot was joined in promoting this research effort by numerous community partners who, just like us, were passionate about serving and strengthening within the nonprofit sector. So I just want to take a moment to give a special thank you to the teams at Louisiana Blue, Porticus Foundation, Greer Foundation, Regeneron, and Volunteer New York for helping us share this research effort more broadly. And definitely a huge thank you to any respondents that may be on the line with us today. So go ahead and shout out in the chat if you happen to be someone who did answer this survey effort. We really appreciate the time and care you put into these responses and just the investment that shows in our collective ability to better resource you and better resource the nonprofit sector. So thank you so much for taking the time to do that. And then a few other notes I wanted to make. We do feel confident sharing these results as a survey that captured nonprofit leadership insights. 77% of the respondents identified themselves as having a director level or higher position within their organization. And this includes board roles. 77%. So director level, executive director, CEO, or board member or board leader positions would fall into that category. Additionally, additional 10%, of respondents indicated that they were at the manager level. Again, reinforcing that this data is from folks who are very well-established nonprofit professionals and leaders. We had definitely a skew towards respondents that identify as women versus those who identify as a man. So 68% of our survey takers identify as a woman versus only 27% identifying as a male, which isn't uncommon, as we know from other nonprofit sector research efforts, that the nonprofit sector does skew female. However, it'll be interesting as we start talking about the types of organizations that we pulled in through this survey, as you'll see that many of our organizations identify as woman-led in a higher quantity than the sector at large, which we'll get to that in a moment. And then one other note just on gender identity, we also collected responses from those who identify as outside of the traditional gender binary, genderqueer, non-binary, transgender, etc. But the segment was too small to run statistically significant segment analysis. So I just wanted to mention that right off the top. All right. Some other notes about our survey respondents, and these are more on the organizational level. So you'll get to know the types of organizations that are representative in the insights that you'll be reading through today. So we had a really diverse issue area representation. We allowed respondents to select multiple issue areas, as we know that nonprofit missions are often tough to encapsulate in just one selection. So we did offer respondents the opportunity to select multiple. And so that's why you'll see the percentages here do not add up to 100. And that was very purposefully done. But out of our 571 respondents, these are the top 5 issue area segments that are present in our research. So education, youth development, community development, social services, and health and nutrition are going to be the most represented in our research. And they were closely followed by organizations in the arts, culture, and humanities space, the diversity and inclusion space, and the workforce development space as well. And then we also feel really confidently sharing that this survey effectively engaged small, early stage, and volunteer-led nonprofits. 68% of survey takers represented organizations with an annual budget of $1 million or less. In addition to this, I can share that 21% of our respondents represent organizations with $0 to $25,000 in annual budget each year, 21%. So as we go through the data, it does have that slant of being from organizations who are truly small and scrappy, grassroots-led, startup potentially, those who may have never received funding from an institutional funder or a corporate sponsor previously. Additionally, 63% of our respondents represent organizations with 5 or less full-time equivalent employees. And to dig in on that a little bit more, 23% of respondents, so nearly a quarter of our survey takers, indicated that they represented organizations with 0 paid employees. So we have really, really great, valuable insights on these volunteer-led organizations, truly like community-led organizations, which is really exciting. A few other notes before I move on. 52% of our respondents represent women-led organizations. We asked folks to share more details on the leadership type of the organizations that they represent. And we indicated 50% or more of the executive leadership team identifying as a certain demographic segment, and this spanned from women-led to youth-led to immigrant-led to disabled-led, etc. And so 52% of our respondents represent women-led organizations, which definitely is above the sector mean, outpacing field data that tells us about 42% of boards are women-led, and 22% of nonprofits are led by a female executive director or CEO. So our 52% number definitely stands in stark comparison to that. And then 33% of our respondents represent BIPOC-led organizations. So this encapsulates Asian American or Pacific Islander-led, Black or African American, Hispanic, Latine, or Spanish-led, Indigenous American or Alaskan Native, as well as Middle Eastern or North African-led. And one additional note here is that a fairly significant chunk of our responses do come from senior-led organizations, which is important as we think through generational changes in the nonprofit space as well, and just shifts that are occurring in the ages of folks who are engaged in volunteer work, in nonprofit leadership, etc. Okay, so let's dig into what nonprofits indicated their top capacity needs were currently. We asked organizations to reflect on how resource access had impacted them negatively or positively in the previous 12 months. And what we found was across the board, nonprofits had been dealing with decreases in funding sources, funding access, and volunteerism access. And so let's start with the fundraising side of things. So we found that 29% of our respondents had indicated that in the previous 12 months, they had seen a decrease in Gen Ops funding availability. They had also, 28% saw a decrease in programmatic funding at their organizations, and 29% seen a decrease in individual giving as well. So we're seeing, and this doesn't push against other sector research efforts as well. I know there have been really interesting reports from the National Council on Community Service, as well as Nonprofit Quarterly has partnered with some great organizations, Bridgespan, who are all saying that fundraising on an individual basis has been decreasing, and the organizations who responded to this survey through Taproot have reflected that as well. So as the access to financial resources has been dropping, we also asked organizations to reflect on access to volunteer or capacity building resources as well. And so we asked in 3 different buckets. So the first one, 25% of our nonprofit respondents indicated that they've seen a decrease in traditional or hands-on volunteer engagement over the past year. Additionally, 20% have seen a decrease in skills-based or pro bono volunteer engagement. So these in-kind resources that Taproot will be spending a fair bit of time during today's event talking about. And then finally, 25% of the nonprofit respondents indicated that they've experienced a decrease in board support or participation as well. So as we're dealing with decreased access to financial resources, unfortunately, that's also corresponding with decreased access to these capacity building and strengthening resources as well. And as we saw, since many of the organizations that we're talking about as part of this response pool are volunteer-led organizations or very small organizations, even just one change in a funder or 1 or 2 board members stepping back or stepping away from an organization can have a tremendous effect on that small organization because those presences are outweighed because of the small scale. And so this is definitely something that organizations such as Taproot and other intermediaries, other companies, foundations need to have in mind if we do have a dedicated focus for working with startups, working with grassroots-led organizations, et cetera. I want to talk more specifically about some hurdles that we heard from nonprofits when it comes to this idea of utilizing skills-based volunteers or utilizing pro bono / in-kind resources. Because as we saw in this previous slide, we see a 20% decrease reported from nonprofits here, which is the smallest decrease across the board. I want to note that we're going from around 30% for financial resources and then 25% for the board and traditional volunteers and only 20% for pro bono, which great, but we can do better. And so Taproot dug in with survey respondents and we asked them to share a little bit more about, well, what do you think is harming your access to skills-based volunteer resources? What do you think is causing a hurdle or a barrier to access in any way? And yes, Jerry, the slides will be provided in the follow-up email from this event. And so definitely feel free to dig more into these. I know I'm going to be going quick through some of these data slides, and you may not have a chance to dig in as much as you'd love here during this event, but we'll share the PDF afterwards along with the recording. So some of those skills-based volunteer utilization hurdles I noted on the slide here. Number one, across the board, so across the segments that we pulled in through this research effort, was absolutely lack of time to manage capacity building resources. We know that skills-based volunteer resources, they're a different type of partnership than a traditional volunteer, right? You can't just bring in a pro bono consultant and point at a computer and say, all right, make me my marketing plan for 2025, right? There's onboarding and there's vetting of that resource. There's onboarding of that resource. There's effective feedback and project management that needs to go into working with a skills-based volunteer. And when you have nonprofits who are already so strapped for time, this absolutely is a barrier. So how can we make the actual process of pro bono project management easier and more palatable for nonprofits? It's kind of the question that we're walking away from this specific stat with. Our next barrier that was indicated by nonprofits was this idea that sure, pro bono or in-kind resources, it sounds great in theory, but we're not sure what is possible or available for us, right? Pro bono, many people still hear that term and think of legal support, which great legal resources exist out in the field for nonprofits and for individuals, an absolutely valuable form of in-kind that organizations should be using. But they're unsure what's available outside of the legal space, right? So there's still some education that needs to happen, and some brand awareness for skills-based volunteering, for pro bono and capacity building. There's some work that we need to do and other intermediaries need to do to inform organizations on what is possible through this really valuable form of resource raising for nonprofit organizations. Make it really tangible for them. Thirdly, there's a desire for best practices training for both sides of pro bono partnership. So we heard this overwhelmingly as well, that not only are nonprofits not sure what's possible to achieve through a project with a skilled volunteer, but they're also, so they don't feel like they're ready to take on the resource. But also they feel like volunteers at times are not ready to step in to consult in the nonprofit environment. We talked with some organizations who felt they had received just such valuable connections with volunteers, and they were so grateful for the high level of corporate support and advice and energy that was being directed towards their organization. But they struggled with the jargon, and they struggled with corporate skill sets or corporate professionals coming in and almost taking a copy and paste method of, oh, well, I did this at my big company, and I think you should just apply it here at your organization, without taking the time to really get to know, well, there's a huge difference between a 6-person nonprofit and a 600-person company. And that same solution isn't going to directly apply to us. So taking the time to do the research and design efforts that need to come with really high quality consulting relationships, and especially when companies or employees are translating their skills into the nonprofit sector. So there's definitely a big need, a big desire for best practices training, for user readiness for both nonprofits and volunteers, so that we can make really successful in-kind donations possible. And then the fourth item I wanted to note here as a hurdle that was called out by our nonprofit respondents was around the actual implementation of the pro bono deliverable. So they end the project, they have this wonderful solution. Maybe they have a new budget for the year, or a new IT framework, a new list of marketing strategies that incorporate their strategic plan and all of the different marketing channels that they use. They have this really beautiful deliverable, and now comes the need to put it into action. Nonprofits report that it's challenging to actually then have the time and have the knowledge of how to then implement the pro bono deliverable effectively. And there's a few different types of solutions that we could employ here. More pro bono to then help implement past pro bono that's been delivered. That's definitely one of them. But also more training on the skills-based volunteer side on, okay, you need to prepare your nonprofit partner so that they're ready to implement the project when you hand it over to them. So how, again, can we go back to this best practices idea and figure out how to make sure that it's a really successful project, not just successful in handing over like, great, I'm done, but successful in handing it over and ensuring that it's not just going to sit on a shelf. The nonprofit's going to be effectively able to use that solution immediately. And I'm wondering if nonprofits on the line, if any of these 4 big hurdles resonate with you. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts in the chat, or maybe it's something, maybe your main hurdle with utilizing skills-based volunteers is something outside of these buckets. Definitely let me know. I'm curious to hear your insights. But as you share that, I'm going to quickly go through some other stats. So we asked nonprofits about the professional skills that their nonprofits were interested in leveraging as a capacity building resource over the next 12 months. So we asked them to consider the support that would help them build or strengthen organizational capacity and resiliency over the next year. And so those are the stats that you're seeing here on the slide. Nonprofits were able to select more than one option. And I know the text is kind of small here, so I'm going to read out the top 5 for you. Our top 5: development or fundraising, marketing and communications, business planning and strategy, design or creative, and data evaluation or analytics. So quick question for the folks who are tuned in. Who wants to wager a guess on how this data changed when we then asked respondents the same question, but we told them you can only pick one capacity building area? So in this question, they were allowed to answer as many as they wanted. But how did this data change when they could only pick one? So what do you think was the top area that nonprofits shared? If we can only get capacity building support in one place, what would it be? Benita thinks it's fundraising and development. Oh, thank you. Casey says these challenges definitely resonate with me. It's, I would say I'm happy to hear that, but I'm not happy to hear that you're facing any challenges at all. We can talk through, hopefully we can figure out some solutions to address that, Casey. Michael also thinks it's fundraising. You are both correct. When we ask nonprofits, all right, if you can only choose one, this is how their responses changed. You can see, again, it's small text on the slide, so I'm going to read out the top 5 areas for you again. So development or fundraising, 33% of our respondents indicated that this is the one area that they would choose to leverage capacity building or strengthening support in the year ahead, if they had to choose just one. Number 2 was marketing and communications. Number 3 was business planning or strategy. And then this is where we start to see some changes from that previous selection, because instead of design and creative, instead of some of the more external facing items, nonprofits do report wanting to dig more into that internal infrastructure piece. So number 4 ended up being data evaluation and analytics. And then number 5, we had a 3-way tie with human resources, accounting and finance, and information technology. I'm curious again, with the nonprofits on the line, does this line up with what you're feeling in terms of where you most need capacity building and volunteer support in the year ahead? Definitely let us know in the chat box. It was really heartening to see that nearly 90% of our respondents, so at 89% of our survey takers, did plan to utilize skills-based volunteer support. That's great for an organization like Taproot to see, right? We have the resources, come and make use of these resources. But that means that it's incumbent on Taproot and other volunteer intermediaries, companies, grant makers, to make sure that we have plans in place to make skills-based volunteer resources, to make pro bono and capacity building resources readily available and easily accessible, so that 90% of nonprofits across the sector can make use of these resources in the year ahead. So the big question for us is, okay, are you ready to service this many organizations? A little bit more about this nonprofit desire for skills-based volunteers. We dug in through a few different questions in this survey, and I've put a few of the key takeaways here. Obviously, the biggest need that nonprofits are seeking pro bono to fulfill is to build capacity at a resource-strapped nonprofit. I feel like that one's pretty straightforward. So on to some of the other ones. Across the board, folks were really interested in skills-based volunteers as a way to bring new supporters into their network. Because it's a deeper form of relationship, they're able to really capitalize on these relationships, on these partnerships, to either build awareness of their mission. Maybe they're using pro bono to help bring in more support, more funders, more volunteers, or because it's a deeper relationship, that volunteer, after they complete one pro bono engagement, they've seen success in converting them into an advocate or a donor or a board or a staff member even. So again and again, Taproot has countless examples of these types of relationships becoming ongoing ones instead of one-time ones. Additionally, nonprofits utilizing skills-based support to strengthen their own professional skills has become an even more important reason that nonprofits desire access to this tool. Nonprofit leaders report they don't want to make strategic decisions in a vacuum. And often if they don't have a leadership network, if they don't have, the social capital around them or the board built up around them quite yet, to have thought partners to be able to bounce these big growth decisions off of, this is where pro bono consultants make a huge mark on the trajectory and the ongoing sustainability and resiliency of nonprofit organizations. And then finally, nonprofits shared that they see pro bono and skills-based programming as a great way to strengthen relationships with their existing grant maker or corporate partners or funders as well. So if a funder has offered a GenOps grant or a programming grant, and then backs it up with access to capacity building resources, there is this feeling of, okay, so I have both the financial and the infrastructure resource access that I'm looking for. How can I combine those budgets or those grants together and really multiply the effects of them? Okay, so I have a few slides here, and just I'm keeping an eye on the time. I'm not going to have a chance to go through all of them, but I did want to leave folks, as you walk away from this event, I did want to leave you just with a few ideas of, okay, well, how tactically could this work in the next year? So we've seen needs from nonprofits. We've heard about what their hurdles are, what their motivations are. But how can I, as an individual, or how can I, as someone at a company, how can I actually make a move to bridge this nonprofit resource gap in the next year? And what I'll say here is that the great thing about skills-based volunteerism is that it's not a finite resource, right? There's no need for nonprofits to select just one capacity building area to leverage support in, like we saw on the slide previous, which gives companies and foundations and individuals like you and I countless opportunities and options to dive into supporting our favorite causes by focusing in on our unique specialties. And so I want to go through and just leave you with a few thoughts and ideas here, but you'll receive the slide deck. So even if we don't get to cover every one of the ideas I had stocked in here, you can always scroll through after the fact. But I wanted to start with this fundraising bucket because it was the top reported need for our nonprofit survey takers, right? So 65% of nonprofits indicated a need for development or fundraising capacity support in the year ahead. And so let's get into that a bit. How can skills-based volunteerism, how can pro bono help fulfill this need? And so we have here on the slide listed several examples of how you can translate this capacity building projects into very real fundraising and development benefits on the nonprofit side, just by using corporate skill sets, right? So a few examples here, and some of this is just making a translation between a very nonprofit specific need, right? Fundraising. That term can often scare some of our corporate volunteers off. They're like, I don't know how to fundraise. I don't want to get on a phone call and just start soliciting donations for an organization. So I'm not interested in doing fundraising support. Well, that's not all that it means, right? And we know that 65% of nonprofits, this is their top need. So let's figure out how we can make that translation into the nonprofit sector, make sure we're really centering their needs. And so you can do so through projects like, helping them build out their impact measurement strategy. Donors want to see that the nonprofit has a reliable mission, that they're proving results of their programming on their community. And you can't do that without a program evaluation strategy in place, right? So that's absolutely a place where corporate skill sets can be incredibly valuable for helping build up the ability for nonprofits to be really successful fundraisers, both with individual giving and institutional giving. Things like creating a business plan with a nonprofit for the first time, figuring out how they map their revenue generation efforts back to their mission-driven programming in the first place, incredibly valuable. That's an infrastructure staple, right, that they need to have in place so that then they can figure out all of the different ways that they're bringing support into their organization. And then lots of other ideas on the slide too. Let's zoom to, I want to talk about HR. It's one of my favorite buckets that nonprofits can utilize pro bono capacity building support in. So we had 31% of our survey respondents indicate a need for human resources or leadership development efforts or support in the year ahead. A few ideas in this bucket, right? Because nonprofits, our greatest resource is the people that make our work possible. You have to have really, really passionate, intelligent, visionary people to make this work happen and to not get exhausted and burnt out by it on a day-by-day basis. And so having someone come in with knowledge of conducting an HR assessment, making recommendations, creating an employee or a volunteer handbook for the first time, outlining your policies, conducting a board effectiveness audit, figuring out, all right, are we making the most use of the resources, of the people power that we do have currently available at the organization? What more could we be doing for them to support them? And what more could they be doing to support our work more efficiently? And so you'll see many more ideas here. Love the idea of using leadership coaching as a way to continue developing rising staff members at your organization as well. And when you receive the deck, you'll receive recommendations in a few other areas like marketing, finance, etc. But for the time being, just being cognizant of the clock, I want to make sure I have a chance to just cover, all right, what's next? You have this data available. So what can we expect to come next from Taproot and come next from the sector as well? So from Taproot's end, you can expect we'll be releasing a downloadable resiliency survey key takeaways guide. So coming in 2025. So if you've registered for this webinar, we'll make sure that you receive first access to this downloadable resource as soon as it's available in the next 2 or so months. So stay tuned following the holidays for that. We'll have more segment analysis available and some additional field takeaways as well. But as I mentioned right at the top, one of Taproot's goals in conducting this survey in the first place was so that we can build more responsive programming and resources. And so one of the main things that you can expect from us going forward is just keeping our word on just creating more tailored resources for organizations, for individuals and institutions as well, who are interested in leveraging skills-based volunteerism as a really powerful way to mobilize networks or to meet their social impact goals. So more events, more best practices, trainings that are readily available. Taproot's tools and resources are free of cost for nonprofits, small businesses, and volunteers, and always will be, because again, as you'll see on the slide, one of the things that we can commit to is a continued focus on inclusive resource access and stripping away any barriers to access. But importantly, what is Taproot doing, but what are you planning on doing next? What are your next steps? So after hearing about nonprofit needs, after knowing, all right, we have nonprofits who are the visionary leaders, they are the experts in figuring out, okay, in order to solve this community challenge, we need to apply these solutions to it. They're the experts in that. How can I, in the year ahead, support them, listen to them, and do whatever I can to get them the resources they need to thrive? Seek out nonprofit perspectives on their needs. Even since conducting this survey, we heard at least 60% of the respondents were US-based. The nonprofit sector is going to already have change their needs and change their resource projections for the year ahead, just based on some of the political changes that have already happened in the U.S. since this survey was taken. And so that's another reason to just talk to your nonprofit network members, get a sense of what they're most worried about, what they're most excited about, and see where your unique skills or your unique social capital, your advocacy could play the biggest role. And then set your social impact goals for 2025. Whether you are a nonprofit professional or leader yourself, or coming from a company or foundation, set those goals and figure out how you're going to hold yourself accountable to them throughout this next year. We all really need to step up and step in for nonprofit leaders, knowing what a challenging time period it has already been leading up into this point, and then knowing the challenging environment that they are set for in the year ahead. So socialize skills-based volunteer support, socialize pro bono capacity building as a resource. You as an advocate has a lot of power in and of itself. And then, of course, join the Taproot network, right? We're here to help build this bridge between nonprofits and the resources that they need to thrive. And so create your Taproot account and reach out to us with any questions. We're here to serve you and to help make skills-based volunteerism this really accessible, high-quality resource for nonprofits. So use us, lean on us. We're always happy to answer questions. So on that note, any questions that I can answer for you all? I've tried keeping up in the chat as we've been going, but I apologize if I missed anything along the way. I see, I saw someone called out, there's a concern about the anti-DEI focus next year. And so that's very real. We have to be ready to, if organizations or governmental organizations, I should say specifically, are preparing to pull back funding resources from organizations that are focused on social justice or diversity and inclusion, workforce development, anything of that nature, then how can we be prepared to step up and help fulfill that resource gap that's going to be created from government resources being pulled away? And increased hands-on volunteer participation, increased board support, and increased skills-based volunteer participation is going to need to be huge for those types of organizations. We know they are going to be incredibly impacted with these political shifts. Really good point, Casey. Thank you for calling that out. And then I'm seeing a lot of folks in the chat just chiming in around fundraising, PR, general strategy and planning. Those are huge. I know one thing we heard from nonprofits as part of this effort was this idea of, where do I even start when it comes to utilizing skills-based? And it's a tough one to answer, but that's why we've tried to make more resources available in the form of just brainstorming, having solution sessions with a third-party strategy expert, just to get you out of your own bubble as a nonprofit leader, getting you talking with someone who is 100% in a different perspective or a different field than you, and just spitballing ideas, even for an hour. We have found that nonprofits are gravitating towards that resource offering more and more. We call them consultation sessions or solution sessions, depending on the program format. But that's definitely raised in popularity over the past few years. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it's tied to this idea of, I just don't want to be making strategic decisions in a silo, in a vacuum. And because of how isolated nonprofit leaders at these small organizations are, that's why they're finding this need for more planning resources in general. All right, I see a few questions are coming in. Best practices for volunteers, as is interesting as a takeaway. Yeah, volunteer required onboarding. I think that's absolutely on the table, Jerry, for Taproot and other intermediaries and partners as well. I know something we're thinking about is, how do we really beef up the volunteer onboarding and make sure that they feel confident and comfortable diving into nonprofit consulting. This is a first for many of our volunteer community members as well, this opportunity to work in a new sector, work outside of a traditional corporate environment. And so we want to be responsive to those needs as well. And we know that by leaning into volunteer readiness for nonprofit consulting, that it ends in higher quality deliverables for nonprofits. So I 100% agree with you. And we'll be working on leaning into nonprofit and volunteer readiness, best practices, more resources in the year to come. What is your first step to contact volunteers? Well, if you're talking about Taproot's programs, you'll have to create your Taproot account in order to then tell us what your nonprofit's needs are. And depending on those needs, you'll use our projects, you'll use our sessions, you'll jump into some of the events that we have available. But we try and make it as easy to access as possible, but your first step is always going to be creating that Taproot account, which you should see a banner at the top of your screen right now. And then I see one final question I think we have time for is, are there any NGOs advocating that nonprofits need to have realistic admin expenses to be able to provide sustainable services? Yes. So I can't remember the exact stat, but it's around 9% that nonprofits on average spend on overhead expenses. So admin, back office expenses, marketing, operations, etc., compared with nearly 25% that companies and for-profit organizations spend on admin, back end. And so by not being able to invest in the infrastructure of our organizations financially, it strips away nonprofits' abilities to create really strong and resilient organizations that are sustainable and able to withstand political changes or funding shifts or volunteerism shifts. It puts us on shakier ground. And so I would say there's definitely some great organizations out there that are measuring that, but it is a fairly known and accepted fact at this point that there's a huge difference in nonprofits versus for-profits' ability to spend financial resources on their own infrastructure. All right. So I know I've taken us right to time. Really quickly, as a follow-up, we're going to share the recording to this event. We are going to share a copy of the deck and a few other resource links as well. And please stay in touch. Like I said, we'll be launching key takeaways from this research effort in early 2025. So that's something that we will be in touch with as well, and are excited to just share more with the field and just mobilize collectively around, all right, it's time to step up for nonprofit organizations, and we are all ready and excited and knowledgeable about how we can do that, how we can do so as individuals or at the institutions that we're a part of. So I appreciate you all taking the time to be here with us today, and we'll be in touch through email shortly. Bye, everyone.